Doing good. How are you?
Good, we're live here. So I love catching up with you when we're live here.
Yeah.
So today I just came up with the idea of let's talk about histamine and let's talk about the 101 on histamine. If you're listening to this, then you're listening to it live through our Facebook group, Your Genetic Type, but we will also be putting this on our podcast, Your Genetic Type, as well. So you should know who we are right now, but both John and I practice functional medicine. John's private practice is in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm in Boca Raton, Florida. And together we've made Your Genetic Type. And our goal is to help get you to understand your biology and get results faster. And John, why don't you give us sort of an intro on what this whole histamine thing is?
Yeah. So the histamine thing really kind of falls into something that I know I see and I know you see with people we work with that, just have chronic health issues that just can't get the needle going in the right direction. And that's really kind of how this Your Genetic Type concept evolved, is what are these missing pieces that somebody may be experiencing that hasn't been investigated or hasn't been addressed. And histamine, histamine control, histamine breakdown is a big factor, whether it be histamine regulation of the gut or histamine regulation outside the gut. It can lead to a whole list of chronic issues. We think histamine, we think, sinus issues, we think, allergies to pollens, and then it's like that's where it stops. But histamine is so much more, where histamine can affect GI issues. So people with, food sensitivities, reoccurring SIBO, reoccurring leaky gut issues, histamine's got to be on the radar. If somebody has, other issues like skin issues or anything neurological like a headache or, a neurological autoimmune disease, histamine, it has to be something that's got to be investigated, because we know histamine is an excitatory chemical in the body, and it is that necessary evil, but in too much for too long, it can lead to a lot of chronic breakdown and a lot of chronic symptoms. So histamine a lot of times is a huge missing piece of the puzzle. And that's why in this Your Genetic Type concept, one of the genetics type that we formulated is the histamine type. And based on, somebody's health challenges or chronic symptoms, we could really pinpoint that histamine may be a piece of the puzzle. It has to be investigated. It has to be supported.
Yeah, and I think the problem is a lot of people that have allergies and sneezy and pets and danders and pollens, they're aware of that, although they're not necessarily aware of what also contributes to histamine release. But the problem is with people that don't have the stereotypical sneezy, redness, congestion, that are still creating histamine reactions, and more importantly, have the genetic susceptibilities to have challenges with that. So they are a histamine type and they're not putting two and two together. So maybe let's kind of talk about that in terms of what's the genetic component with this?
Yeah, so with the genetic component, there are key genes that really relate to histamine breakdown in the body. And I kind of put this into three buckets, right? One bucket is the histamine bucket that primarily focuses with gut function. And there are specific gene components that play into that. One of the main genes is a gene called ABP1, and that gene codes for an enzyme called diamine oxidase. Diamine oxidase, its responsibility in the gut is an enzyme that's responsible to break down the histamine that's in the gut, primarily from the food we eat. Just like if we take a digestive enzyme that contains amylase or lipase to help break down the food components, diamine oxidase or DAO breaks down the histamine from the food we eat. And some people genetically have weakness there where they can't make enough of that DAO enzyme. And so then what happens is their histamine load in the gut has a likelihood to stay high. And if that's the case, you've got an environment for a lot of inflammation. You've got an environment for a lot of opportunistic or abnormal bacteria to flourish. You got an environment for leaky gut, an ongoing issue. So if somebody's got multiple food sensitivities, ongoing GI issues, they might want to look at that bucket to figure out, okay, is there a issue with maybe there's too much histamine in the diet and they can't break it down fast enough because there's not enough diamine oxidase enzymes? Or is there a genetic component where they go into a little bit genetically weaker where they can't make enough of that enzyme to break that down. And so you can look at genetics and you can actually test for DAO enzymes to see, are you deficient? And that could be a big, big win. And when I see that through genetics or testing, that all, more often than not is completely life-changing to somebody, whether it be GI symptoms or something else. Then that second bucket is kind of outside the gut, and that kind of deals with the genes that are responsible for breaking down histamine. All right. And histamine, like I said, is not necessarily evil. You want histamine released because it gets white blood cells to an area of inflammation or stress to start the healing process. But then the body's got to go to work to start breaking down that histamine after those white blood cells have been triggered, right? And we have key genes that are responsible for that. Some of those key genes are dependent on methylation, like the HNMT gene, which is histamine and methyltransferase. You have other genes like MAO, PON1. There's a whole list of genes that kind of relate and are responsible for the regulation of how the body can regulate and break down the histamine that is outside the gut that is naturally produced and released. And some people have a lot of genetic weakness there. And when there's a lot of genetic weakness there, yes, you can have the typical, like you mentioned, kind of sinus and allergies. And everybody kind of knows that, all right, yes, I have a histamine issue, I have an allergy issue, but it's so much more. And within that kind of second bucket, there are gene factors that deal with histamine receptors. And so every tissue in the body has a histamine receptor. And we know that these histamine receptors are coded a little bit differently in terms of where they're at. And some people may have a lot of weakness for histamine receptors, might be in the brain or cardiovascular, in reproductive tissues. And what I kind of explain, if there's histamine receptor issues, it's almost like you have histamine that's going to go into a receptor site and it's going to fit perfectly. But if you got these gene mutations on the receptors, those receptors are morphed a little bit, and a lot of the histamine just kind of bounces right off. And that causes an increase in histamine that's systemic or in the blood. And then that can lead to a lot of other issues. And then that third bucket is kind of a lot of things. It's kind of like a buzzworthy thing, and it's kind of that mast cell story, right? And mast cells are an immune cell that release histamine. And I see a lot of people that think they have like a mast cell issue, but it may be more of an issue with that first or the second bucket. And what the mast cell issue is some people do have a genetic tendency or weakness or have other epigenetic stressors that cause these immune cells to degranulate or to rip open and just dump excess amounts of histamine to the system for no reason. And there are, and the mast cell issue usually driven by epigenetic factors. We know that things like oxalates and EMF stress and glutamates, increased estrogen in the body, food components, a lot of things that stimulate those mast cells, mycotoxins that can cause an increased release in that. So if you kind of see that first bucket and that second bucket overfilling, and you're addressing from a genetic standpoint, and the needle's not moving fast enough, then you kind of go to that third step which is kind of looking at all those epigenetic stressors that are triggering the excess release of histamine. Faster you can break it down, which then kind of lets everything kind of fall apart on you.
Yeah, and I think that helps the clinician help the client in terms of how can we spot reduce, if you will, like how can we get the biggest bang for the buck where their actual problem is. And I think a couple of things I wanted to mention is, while you can still, like you said, have those two buckets not going on, and then that third bucket happening or the two buckets are going on and people think that it's mast cells, but really it's a challenge with the histamine receptors or their DAO or their clearance. But the vice versa is true too, in terms of their histamine clearance and DAO production and methylation is working fairly well, but they do have so much epigenetic factors that put a lot of the cars on the mast cell highway. And even though their exit histamine ramps are working well, there's just so much traffic on there. Yeah. And that's what you say too. Like, that's the other thing, like it still resonates with where a lot of the times when we're working with clients, you'll probably agree with this, is they're not too far off in terms of what they're doing. They just may not be doing it properly or enough. Like, I know you mentioned doing the Dunwoody lab on someone who was already taking DAO enzyme. And it turned out that even with the DAO enzyme, their DAO levels were so low and their histamine levels were so high, and that ratio was off. And as a result, they needed to take more. So maybe that's what you were talking about in terms of when you look at someone's genetics, it could be a major win in terms of, okay, we're gonna give you some of this nutrient to support you. So maybe we're jumping ahead here, but what's your strategy, John, on that in terms of, hey, we looked at your genetics, You do have some of these major gene challenges with clearing histamine in the GI tract, which is the ABP1 that codes for DAO, which, very popular speaker in the circuit talked about the DAO enzyme itself and made a mistake, and it was more the ABP1 enzyme that codes for the DAO. But either way, the DAO enzyme is not being produced in the GI tract. It's not clearing out that extracellular histamine. Or you have methylation issues like you've heard of MTHFR or somewhere down the line, and that's another exit ramp that is not clearing it out. And then last, like you said, the receptors are hitting the receptors are not allowing the neurotransmitter to bind, and it's creating all that excess histamine. So you're mentioning strategies to support the clearance. So how would someone go about that in terms of, hey, I got the symptoms, I got the genetic polymorphisms, and now I want to figure out how to approach this?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a step-by-step process. If symptoms really relate to histamine, and the thing is and here's the thing: is a lot of symptoms can be pinpointed back to histamine at some level. All right, so with every client or patient I work with, histamine's on the table until proven wrong, right? There might be other factors that are big players, might be epigenetic stressors, detoxification issues, maybe their genetic type is something else based on some other, based on quiz scores or subjective complaints. But histamine still is a factor because histamine, it is a piece of the puzzle at some level, right? And so then what you're doing, you're talking about investigating the genetic aspect to figure out, okay, is there a lot of genetic susceptibility in these three buckets? All right, especially in the first two, is there a lot of genetic susceptibility in the ABP1 gene? Is there a lot of genetic susceptibility in that second bucket, which deals with histamine clearance? And there's a whole bunch of genes that kind of fall into that. And you even mentioned like MTHFR and methylation component can be a factor in that as well. So then you kind of figure out, okay, how much of a genetic factor this is, because that can kind of give you an insight of, how aggressive do you have to give from a supportive standpoint? And then from there, you want to investigate, right? You mentioned the Dunwoody Labs test. That's a really great test. They call it it's a leaky gut test and an intestinal barrier test, but it tests histamine and it tests DAO. And if somebody's histamine levels are high and their DAO levels are low, I know that the recommended dosage on a bottle of, a DAO enzyme, is going to maybe not be enough, right? If they're taking one twice a day or one with meal, that may not be enough initially, right? It's almost like I use an analogy back to kind of that bucket analogy, but now we're talking a bucket of water, and that water in the bucket is histamine. If your histamine level is so high that water's spilling over the edge all the time, and you're taking one or two of those enzymes and doing a low histamine diet, it may not be enough to stop the water from filling up and spilling over the edge, right? It's almost like you're putting water in the bucket faster than you're taking it out, so the water's ongoing to spill onto the floor, right? So you got to get a little more aggressive so you can get your starting point of that histamine load down below the edge, and then you start feeling better. And then typically you're able to loosen the reins a little bit. You're able to decrease the amount of supplementation support. You're able to loosen the reins on the diet a little bit. And as long as you kind of work in this level and you don't get to that edge where the water spills on the floor when you're symptomatic, you have a better quality of life and you're managing things, right? And so some people need to hit things a little more aggressive. And that's something I see. I see a lot of people that come in, they come to me because they've been told or they feel they have mast cell activation syndrome. They know they have a histamine issue. We look at genetics. We look at the Dunwoody test. Sure enough, it confirms all of that. But the thing is they're already taking, like you mentioned, already taken some of these supplements. They're already taken some Diamine oxidase enzymes. They're taking other products out there to support histamine clearance, but they're taking not nearly enough to get the needle going in the right direction. And so then from there, it's like, hey, pushing the gas pedal down until we start noticing therapeutic change. And then from there, we can start backing off once we start getting this under control. And that's something I see all the time is, you mentioned the Dunwoody test with a client that was taking DAO and the test was really poor. I just had another person this week that I went over a Dunwoody test like that was taking DAO enzymes and a bunch of other histamine-based nutrients on an ongoing basis for being told she has mast cell activation syndrome. And sure enough, her Diamine oxidase was like under 20 and her histamine levels on that test were like 10, taking the support, So it was kind of one of those things like, hey, our first focus is we got to get this histamine story under control. And she's like, well, I'm doing a low histamine diet. I'm taking these support. Well, then you're talking about, we got to get more aggressive, but then we also got to investigate, maybe some of those epigenetic stressors that are causing that histamine to dump more, putting more traffic on the highway, and then the supplemental stuff that she's doing wasn't enough to start clearing some of that traffic. All right. And she's just putting more traffic on faster than she can clear it, putting more water in that bucket faster than she can take it out, which was causing things to still be kind of in chaos from a histamine standpoint. And so that's, I think, one thing. If somebody's listening to this and they're doing things to support histamine and they're just kind of scratching the surface on dosage, you're really not going to create any adverse effects by starting to pulse those nutrients up, right? I'm not saying taking a whole bottle of something a day, but if the recommended dosage, like on this, GI His control that we have, which is a Diamine oxidase product, the recommended dose is, 2 capsules per day, right? Because it's a delayed release capsule. That may not be nearly enough. Maybe somebody has to take maybe 6 or 8 a day, 2 or 3 per meal, and maybe, 2 or 3 at bedtime for a week, maybe 2 weeks, to kind of get that histamine level down. And then as they start feeling better, they can start, decreasing the dosage, and bumping the dosage up like that, is going to have really no side effect, because that histamine load is so strong that you're going to start kind of mopping up the water on the floor and feeling better. And then from there, you can start decreasing the dosage.
Yeah, and you're not guessing. I mean,
Yeah.
you've done the Dunwoody test. You've seen it's like the trifecta, right? Their symptoms are there, the objective tests are there, and the genetics are there. And they're doing what they think they should, but they're not doing enough. As far as the investigating elsewhere epigenetically, that would be putting more cars on the mast cell highways. Those would be the other epigenetic factors of, like, say, EMFs or molds, or so I'm talking about all the other things that they're not aware of that are creating more histamines. So let's talk about that, John, because a lot of people aren't aware of that, where not only histamine until proven otherwise, iron overload until proven, not iron dysregulation, won't say iron overload, iron metabolism issues, where there's not getting from point A to point Z very effectively, and that creates some oxidation of that iron, which will create those free radicals, which will create the mast cells, which will create the histamine. So
right.
Maybe talk about some of these other things that should be on people's radar if they are pulsing a little bit higher, but they still have so much on-ramps to that highway. What are those other things?
Yeah, so, what it comes down to is you're trying to investigate realistically what is causing more traffic on the road, right? What is causing more histamine in that bucket of water? And yes, there are genetic factors where you have maybe slow breakdown that just naturally is going to cause more histamine because you're not able to break it down fast enough. But there are a lot of epigenetic factors that stimulate those mast cells. You mentioned kind of the iron overload, right? When you're talking about inflammation or, increased hydrogen peroxide in the body, that in itself is going to stimulate mast cells. A lot of those histamine-based foods, yes, they create an increased load in histamine in the gut, but those histamine foods also will activate or stimulate mast cells to dump more histamine. You talk about, abnormal bacteria in the gut. Okay. You kind of get in this vicious cycle where the histamine creates an environment for those opportunistic bacteria or gram-negative bacteria to flourish, but then the LPS or lipopolysaccharides that those bacteria release in itself are going to stimulate mast cells. Most living infections, Lyme's, bacteria, viruses, stimulate mast cells. Mold and mycotoxins is a huge, huge issue. That is something that people can have ongoing exposure, can have previous exposure, years or decades ago, and they still got those mold spores in the body that are producing those mycotoxins. Huge trigger of mast cells. I mentioned earlier estrogen. Somebody that's a little estrogen dominant or has issues with estrogen clearance, that is going to stimulate mast cells. You talk about different xenobiotics that we're kind of exposed to, different chemicals that we're exposed to, EMF stressors. It really kind of comes down to it where anything in our environment that we know that kind of affects us is going to stimulate this mast cell component. So really what it comes down to is if you have that increased histamine load and you're pushing the gas pedal down on support and things aren't really going in the right direction, you got to put on a detective hat and figure out, okay, what are some of these stressors that are kind of understood that are in our environment, right? We're human. We're exposed to toxins. We're exposed to EMF. We're exposed to heavy metals. We're exposed to food components. We're exposed to, infections on our food, different bacteria on our food that's going to stimulate this stuff. Spend the detective hat and figure out which of those stories is in excess that can be really driving and putting more traffic on the highway or putting more water in the bucket. And that's where I think, from from a simplistic standpoint, understanding your genetic type, understanding that histamine burden, understanding that there's things you can do in terms of a shift, doing a lower histamine diet, taking support that helps the breakdown of histamine outside the cell that supports the HNMT gene, supports methylation activity, supports MAO function like vitamin B2. There's a lot of herbals, stinging that'll, there's a whole, black cumin seed. There's a whole bunch of different things that can help break down, and also supporting the gut histamine component with enzymes like those diamine oxidase enzymes. And if the needle's not budging, then you really probably need to find somebody you work with that can help you through this process, identify those epigenetic stressors that are causing those mast cells to stimulate or activate and dump more histamine and put more traffic on the highway.
Yeah, there's a wealth of information
Yeah.
there, John. That's awesome stuff. So what I see being some of the biggest challenges are, number one, people will say, well, I'm on a low histamine diet and it's not moving the needle.
Right.
And how could you expect it to with everything we just said, in terms of histamine can be released with just stress itself, just that whole psychosocial, someone cutting you off in traffic stress. Histamine can be released with alcohol, and histamine can be released with certain immune challenges as well. So that would be probably the first thing that I think is major challenging is that it's just not about that diet. And then the other one is, if you feel like you have a histamine intolerance and you're supporting the clearance of that, are you addressing all the other epigenetic factors that, like mold and EMF alone, can really cause an overflowing histamine bucket that you're not keeping up with? And I think that's key. I think, you mentioned as well, like, I don't know if you said you had too many gene variants, but when it does get a lot of pollen out there, that's the whole point of our course. Is it's not only the genetic component, but it's where the car accidents are spilling over, so to speak, in the 2-lane highway, which is the perfect storm. And so you could have a nice 8-lane highway, not very much genetic component in terms of your clearance, but you may have so much epigenetic factors that are on the highway that you need that support with too. And that's where I think you really shine, John, in terms of, well, like, put the detective hat, but let's make sure we're getting the clues from the people in terms of what's your symptoms, when do you feel worse, when do you feel better. I think those are really, really key things.
Oh yeah,
for sure.
They're huge aspects, because, and it really kind of comes back to, there's all these different symptoms that relate to histamine, and really understanding and learning how to read your body is huge, because we always talk about pulse of nutrients, right? We want to get to the point where we've got things under control and there were pulse of nutrients. And the same thing, if you're doing a low to moderate histamine diet and you've got this histamine stuff under control, then how much of the diamine oxidase enzymes are you taking? You have a product like this that are you taking one with meal? Are you taking one per day and that's all you need to do? And your body's going to give you feedback, because if you start noticing that, hey, you decrease it and you're to the point where you're just taking one per day and you're loosening the reins too much on the diet, that may eventually catch up with you, and you're going to notice that some of those signs and symptoms come back. So really being in tune with your body in terms of those signs or symptoms can really help you control and manage things, once you get things under control. Especially
when you take the quiz, your genetic type, and like, okay, I have some major challenges here, even when there isn't a lot of cars on the highway, but especially when there is.
Yeah.
John, maybe a couple of things we can talk about with that particular supplement there. Some people mentioned that they don't do well with B6 in the product line there, and they say, well, I can't take it because B6. So we've done a previous video on beast toxicity, and perhaps we can put this in the show notes when we're finished, but maybe just a quick what's going on there perspective, like, hey, I want to take the DAO, I have genetic polymorphisms, but I just know from my supplement history I do terrible with that B6, and why is it in there, and can I use it or not?
Yeah, so when you're talking about some of the other things in some of these formulas that contain DAO, there's other things that a lot of times are put in to help with the histamine aspect, but then there's other cofactors that are needed to, the easiest way to kind of explain it is to help activate, right? to help activate and, to help that enzyme do what it's got to do to help with the breakdown of histidine or with histamine, right? And so, there's people that sometimes, like with, histidine deficiencies, right? Like with this histamine excess in the gut, B6 by itself has been shown in the literature to help activate and help the clearance and conversion of that. And I always use the ingredients of kind of like baking a cake, right? If you're trying to make a cake, you need all these ingredients in the bowl at the right measurements, all the ingredients there, and you got to mix it up to put in the oven so the cake turns out right. So if we're talking about this kind of formulation to help break down histidine or histamine in the gut, right? We need to put all these ingredients in the right measurements in that bowl for the cake to turn out. And if we forget to put one ingredient in and we still throw that cake in the oven, the cake's not going to turn out right. So, yes, there is a concern with, yes, people can have B6 deficiencies, but the thing is when you take the B6 with the diamine oxidase enzyme, the diamine oxidase enzyme is going to not allow very much of that B6 to absorb across the gut because it's going to suck it up that's in that product together synergistically, help activate, help the conversion of that enzyme working more effectively to help break down the histidine and histamine further so it doesn't increase that total histamine load in the gut. So it is kind of like that necessary component that's there. It just enhances the effectiveness of a product like that. And, the breakdown of histidine is very dependent on B6. It's dependent on, B5, but B6 is one of those, the B vitamins that's needed, for help of activation of a process in the body called, or in the gut, decarboxylation, I think is the name of that process that happens with that. The B6 is needed for that histidine breakdown.
Right, right. And basically, you don't want to take the DAO and add the ability to break something down, then you're missing your change on the highway, so to speak. You're missing your toll.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing
Right.
is if you're spending the money on a product that contains diamine oxidase enzyme and it doesn't contain maybe some other factors that have, is it going to be effective? Yeah, it's absolutely going to be effective, right? If you have a product that contains just DAO, it's going to have some impact, right? But when we kind of take a product like this that we, have in the formulation of this, and there's reasons why some of those things are in there, because what it does is enhances the ability where you don't have to take as much and there's more breakdown, and so when you look at how much of that molecular structure that diamine oxidase breaks down in histidine, a product like this one that we have here break down 75,000, parts or molecules or moles of that histidine. And the reason it does that is because the DAO is activated by some other ingredients that are in the product like B6.
Right, right. And it just sort of made me think about too, John, because when we go over a genetic test with someone, we talk about the pyramid, we talk about the expenses of environmental toxins and histamine, iron. And in this case, I want to kind of connect the dots for people that know they have MTHFR. They take methylfolate and it doesn't make any difference whatsoever, but they're a histamine type. And one of the buckets that they have challenges with in clearing out histamine is their intracellular HMT enzyme. And therefore, that MTHFR is being a rate limiting step in their inability to clear out histamine. So maybe simplify that for people. Like how can DAO enzyme or the GI hist control we've made, how would that be helpful for someone who's a histamine-based type that has MTHFR issues? I guess.
Yeah. So if you're talking about, with those three buckets, right, they kind of all work interchangeably. And if there is an issue with histamine in the gut, a lot of that histamine is going to get absorbed into the bloodstream, right? And that does increase the total load of histamine systemically in the body and inside our cells. And so what can happen is if you got weakness in methylation or you got MTHFR variants, and MTHFR does play into methylation because SAMe, the body's primary methyl donor, is dependent for that H and MT gene to work, and it's dependent on methylation and THFR. So what happens if you got this huge excess of histamine, okay, and your methylation activity and MTHFR function, everything else has to prioritize. What's the biggest fish that we're going to use these methyl donors for? Histamine's a fish. And so what can happen is you can use up all your methylation activity to try and just control the histamine, which then leaves you with nothing left over to do other things like make glutathione, make or recycle neurotransmitters or hormones, and then you can be left with a lot of other symptoms like a weakened immune response, mood disorders, adrenal fatigue aspects, and it can all kind of indirectly kind of piggyback or tie back into that histamine burning. And so one thing, if there are histamine issues, somebody's a genetic type and the histamine load is there, one of the things you can do is you can support methylation activity, right? Because it's going to have an impact, not only in affecting, if you're understimulated or, there's symptoms like adrenal fatigue aspects or depression issues or anything that's kind of like that kind of not enough gas in the tank scenario. Pushing methylation is a piece of the puzzle to help get that histamine story under control. And kind of what I tell patients, if they have, this histamine aspect and we're adding in methylation support, that, we're going to do that. And if it gets to a point where they're now a little overstimulated, where they're not sleeping or they're a little like anxious or on edge, we got to back up the methylation support because we're finally making an impact. And now what's happening is there's more methyl donors available to do other things, which then maybe pushing some things a little faster. But it's kind of like just another layer to this when you're talking about, when you're looking at histamine, yes, there's the usual suspects in terms of gut. There's the usual suspects in terms of the HNMT gene, MAOA gene, things of that nature. But also, if you have a lot of issues in some of those understimulated based genes that deal with methylation, methionine synthase, MTR, MTHFR, BHMT, all those genes are going to have some type of impact on how the body can regulate and control histamine. So you need to, consider support there as well. Once you have started taking other things that address histamine in the gut or histamine systemically, and if the needle's not budging, then you're talking about those epigenetic stressors, or do we need to kind of ramp things up by pushing methylation activity with the primary focus of that's going to aid in the clearance of histamine?
Yeah, I mean that's complex stuff, but basically what you're saying is that because the expense of histamine is creating so much draining of the battery, so to speak, the DAO perhaps on its own may preserve some methyl groups, but not at the level that you would need for cellular activity. If you take our quiz and you find that there's some clustering of being an understimulator, then that means you're not putting a lot of gas in the tank, and you potentially can do well by also taking some methyl support in as well as the DAO. What about people that are potentially overstimulated? Do you find a lot of preservation of methyl groups, John, when you have someone take DAO, or not, like in general?
I think the body balances out, right? And so what can happen is, as you start clearing histamine, you're supplementing with DAO or some of these other herbal components that help the histamine break down, and you are preserving methyl donors. That could create an environment where, yes, somebody can maybe stimulate or, trend into an overstimulated presentation. How often does that happen? I don't see it that often. A lot of times maybe somebody goes into it where they already have anxiety or some of those things, and then maybe as you're preserving those methyl donors, those things ramp up. And because you think about what histamine is, right? Histamine is also an excitatory neurotransmitter. So if somebody typically goes into it with a little bit of those overstimulated symptoms to start with, which would be kind of those overstimulated, overmethylated based kind of thought processes, a lot of times when you start preserving those methyl donors, it may just ramp that up. So then you're kind of working that overstimulated scenario in conjunction or ramping that up as you're preserving it. But then there's maybe that need to, all right, start backing off and finding out what's that balance with even the histamine support. So the body, it's always trying to balance itself. It's trying to regulate. And so there is kind of this orchestration of how to address these components. But if somebody typically is overstimulated prior to that, that may ramp it up. I think if somebody doesn't have a lot of those warning signs or they're more understimulated, it's far and few between where I've seen that, allowing those methyl donors to be there is going to have an impact where it shifts them. What I see, it actually just benefits a lot of other stores. Almost it's like you control the histamine and everything else kind of falls in place, and you don't have to work on as many other things because now you are preserving those methyl donors to do other things like methylate, make glutathione, clear neurotransmitters more effectively, DNA repair, all the other things where methylation activity is responsible for all that stuff improves. You know, and just that histamine was a huge roadblock that was just kind of depleting the body so it couldn't do other things.
Yeah, and I just had, it's funny we just talked about this. I just had someone who did take some of that DAO, and they're mentioning that their family members are not happy with them right now because of their excess, you know, overstimulated type. And I mentioned to them, you're preserving some of those extra methyl groups. We had simultaneously given some extra methyl support, so we can back off on that. Also, you know, getting a niacin sort of lozenge and sort of cleaning up some of those extra methyl groups can be very helpful. But I would say this is, which a lot of people do, a knee-jerk reaction where, oh, that's the worst thing ever. It really, really gave me symptoms. I would ask you to think differently as a patient, right, about that, because a lot of clients we work with, they don't notice anything with the supplement. So if you're noticing something bad with the supplement or perceived as bad, tell us why that's a really great thing, John, you know, in terms of,
you know, because you're talking about, you know, optimize or controlling your biology, right, or your genetic expression. I always tell patients or clients, like, we're looking for a change. You know, the change, it could be beneficial, the change could be worse, because the change could be worse because, like you mentioned, you know, what we were talking about previously, you know, you start controlling histamine, you start preserving methyl groups that can now start doing other things your body hasn't been able to do in a long time. You know, like maybe it's preserving those methyl donors to speed up sulfuration and detoxification, because now you maybe haven't been able to clear those mycotoxins or those stressors that were triggering the mast cells and that histamine load, and now you're controlling the histamine burden. You've got more juice in the tank or gas in the tank to do other things like start detoxifying, and then now that maybe creates some ill effects or detox effects that you just got to maybe kind of push through a little bit, or understand that there's other factors like binders or other components that maybe you have to do. So a change is good, you know, because, you know, when you're taking certain supplements that are really geared to address some of these genetic variants, or really geared to address some of the things in the labs that we see, like in a Dunwoody test that looks at DAO and histamine levels, the supplement works, right? It's just the dosage is the art, you know. It's finding out what is that sweet spot that's going to be beneficial. You know, maybe somebody's starting off too fast, right? Everybody's sensitivity is different. And so I've had many patients, like if you're, you know, taking, you know, a methylation support, you're taking the GI His, you know, control product we have that contains the DO enzymes, and maybe one capsule is working and it's working too effectively, that's preserving those methyl groups. Maybe we got to take baby steps. You know, maybe we've got to open those capsules up and do maybe a quarter of a capsule like twice a day for the first couple of days, and then slowly build up. And so, you know, feedback from your body is huge. And that's when we kind of talk about pulsing nutrients, right? So if somebody right out of the gate is having a little bit more of an ill effect where symptoms are ramped up and there's new symptoms, you know, I get excited. I'm like, hey, we're moving the needle, right? We're making a change biochemically or physiologically in your body because we're on the right track. We just got to now determine, how do we do this at a rate that your body can tolerate? And so sometimes it's, let's cut the dose in half. One capsule, we start opening the capsules up and maybe microdose it, where you do a quarter or a half, do that for a couple of days, see how you do, and build up, you know? So kind of rule of thumb is, if you have those reactions, cut everything in half. And if it's a one capsule, open the capsule up and do a half that day, see how you feel. If you have the same response, the next day do a quarter, you know, and then continue to back it off by a half until you notice, hey, I'm tolerating it. Do that for 2 or 3 days and then slowly build back up. And more often than not, if somebody does that, where they decrease the dosage and they kind of microdose it back up, their tolerance when they get back to that initial dosage is completely different. It's like, holy cow, you know, I fell apart with one capsule and it took me maybe 10 days or 2 weeks to get back to one capsule. But now it's like, I'm to one capsule, now I'm going to 2, and it's like, and I'm feeling a whole lot better because now things are moving for the first time ever. Or the first time in a long time.
Yeah, and that's key. I think that's key in terms of, that's our mission, I think, in our education, is these little talks here, right? Because most people get the concepts, but when they apply it, it's not black and white. You take it, you feel better. You don't take it, you don't. It's some, you know, learning curve to that.
Right.
And that's where, you know, practice is key in terms of, well, why would that happen? Like, you know, kind of thing. And well, why don't we back off? So maybe talk about like why we're coming out with a foundation line in terms of some of those mitochondrial energy, just foundational stuff that every genetic type should be aware of. I mean, we're talking about the histamine genetic type, But when a stressor has been going on for so long and you have a demand and supply problem or an expense and income problem, and you're underwater, if you will, upside down, and you're not keeping up with the supply, the demand and the expenses, how your body prioritizes, how that makes a lot of just foundational things fall at the wayside, and what we could be thinking of in terms of maybe not just bringing your dosing down, but think about some of bringing these foundational stuff up.
Right. Yeah, because you talk about there's foundational things that everyone needs, right? You know, you need to support detoxification, you need to support mitochondria, you need to support, clearance in the gut. There's certain things that are foundational, and then there are certain things that are foundational for each genetic type, right? And so when you mention kind of like, the need to, bring certain things up, and so if somebody's maybe not responding and symptoms have been there for a while, you do have to maybe consider what are those foundational things that have to be in place to get things going, right? It's almost like, you talk about, starting a car, or driving a car, right? The foundational things are, making sure you have the keys, to put in the ignition. It's all fine and dandy. It's like, hey, I just filled my tank up with gas and I'm ready to go, but it's like, I don't have the keys to start the car, right? Or you never put it in drive. Like the keys are put in drive is like that foundational thing that gets things going. And so if it's something where, hey, you don't have any gas in the tank and now you're finally able to put gas in the tank, can't start the car, it doesn't matter how much gas in the tank, right? And that's where some of the foundational things come in play. And that's one thing we're doing now is we are kind of creating some foundational products that are really geared for anybody and everybody. There's certain things that I feel everybody should take, and there are certain things that I take every day, my family takes every day, and most of my patients take every day that really doesn't correlate to maybe their genetic type specifically or to lab components, but they're just foundational things like glycine or certain binders like in the gut like chlorella or I'm a big fan of like fulvic and humic acid, some of those things that can really foundationally support a little bit of everything and really can kind of be those pieces that need to be in place when there's stress in the body. And when there's a lot of stress in the body that's been there for a long time, there's even a stronger need for those foundational nutrients to be there, because you got to have the keys to put in the car to turn, start the ignition for all those other things you're doing to be as effective as possible.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Great conversation today. And think next time we could talk about some of those foundational stuff, because I think that would be really key. And you have a couple of protocols in terms of your mitochondrial challenges with the D-ribose and the NADH. Perhaps we can talk about that. So awesome. So as far as a couple really great tools, we mentioned the Dunwoody test. That is the advanced intestinal barrier assessment. It's made by Dunwoody. We have that on our website, so we can post links to that under our Shopify account. Remind me on this one, John. I think every week I ask you about this. Is that one that they can send overseas? I know it's a blood draw, right? Have you sent anyone to?
Yes, we have. I've had patients in Canada and in Europe do it. So yes, we can.
So they just get the proper instructions in terms of how to spin it down properly. And it is really important for sure. I mean, that's one of those tests where you just said, like, I had someone who was doing it, but just, the proof was in the pudding in terms of the test. They were doing it, yet their test results showed really, really high histamine still and really, really low DAO. And also what's really great about that test is, like you said, those gram-negative bacteria, those LPSs, those will also slow down your histamine clearance as well. So if that's there, now you're doing some microbial support as well. So that's a great test. And then we mentioned, of course, the product line. So that's super exciting. Tell us a little bit about this particular product here.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, we're working on getting some foundational products going, but we have a handful of products and more coming out that are really geared to support the specific genetic type. So, what we're talking about today, one of the products we do have available is this GI Hist control. And what this is it is a diamine oxidase product. What it's geared for is people have a lot of GI histamine. People have the ABP1 gene variant, low DAO on a test like the Dunwoody test. Along with a low to moderate histamine diet, that person tends to do better with diamine oxidase enzyme, because you need that diamine oxidase to help break down the histidine or the histamine in food, so that that histamine load doesn't increase and absorb into the body to increase that total histamine load. And so this is something that is, of the DAO products that are on the market, in my opinion, by far one of the best ones based on some of the ingredients. It's a delayed release capsule, which works awesome because the delayed release capsule, if you take a capsule that's not delayed release with these enzymes, it basically busts open. Now you got all those diamine oxidase enzymes that are there. They are going to denature and become less effective over time. Once they're out of the capsule. And so some of that stuff maybe isn't helping break down then all the histamine. So with the delayed release capsule, as that food you're eating is kind of working itself through the digestive tract, a little bit of that DAO, it's kind of squirting out of that capsule to help break down and bind that. It's more effective because of the slow release aspect, but then also it's more effective because you don't have to take as many, which is great.
Right, and you mentioned too, a couple of strategies where obviously if you have the test and genetics, and I mean, I think a no-brainer, knee-jerk sort of reason to take it is if you take Benadryl, probably you're going to want to take a DAO. I mean, that if Benadryl helps you, then you know that this DAO natural support will help you, because Benadryl is depleting your magnesium, which is going to slow down your methylation reactions, which in one of the buckets is going to slow down your clearance of histamine, right?
Yeah.
So you're taking something to speed up and slow down your clearance. But the other thing is that you may want to, in those cases, you would pulse up till you can, notice a difference, because you're not noticing it. But if it's very stimulatory, perhaps you're preserving a lot of methyl groups, you want to start off very slow, and maybe you just break open a capsule and start that way. And so they get that. How do they go about getting that, John?
So we'll put a link to that as well. At the bottom of this talk, along with the Dunwoody test, but that is on our store. So if you go to our website, yourgenetictype.com, and click store, it's there, and it's available for purchase. But we'll put the direct link to the product at the bottom of this replay as well.
Yeah, and maybe we can have like a little promotion where if they purchase the test and the bottle together, give them like a little bit of a discount on that, so that.
So if we can, we'll talk to programmers and get that done, and drop a coupon code in the comment section along with those links in.
Yeah, and if you got questions, that's the thing too, because I would like to do these podcasts live from Facebook so people can ask questions in real time. But it's kind of funky. I don't remember how to get you on the call, and then I know Zoom makes it a lot easier. So this will be uploaded to our podcast and to our Facebook. If you're not part of our Facebook group, it is simply Your Genetic Type. And if you really haven't taken your genetic type quiz yet, really take that. And if any of this resonated with you, and you have major challenges, whether it's allergies and you know about it, or it's GI issues, or even anxieties and mood disorders and brain fog, all of those things has to be on your radar for histamine, and that could be the thing you're missing out on. So I think that's an awesome topic, John, today. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think we covered a lot in this, 45 minutes plus, and hopefully created a lot of answers, to a lot of questions, and maybe create a lot of light bulbs or aha moments for people that are out there that are, struggling. And like you mentioned, go take the quiz, because that quiz may gear you into that histamine type, which may really change your focus and perception on kind of what you have to do to get that needle going in the right direction.
Right, exactly. And, just keep in mind, guys, you're really close, yet you're so far, and you're one or two distinctions away from getting your health back. And really, that's our model at Your Genetic Type, is to be able to control your biology and get results faster. So we'll see you guys next week, and we hope you do well until then. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Take care.